This one's for all you cursive fans or Jane Austen fans even out there. So it's a letter writing kit. In this video, I'll show you how to make the quills here, which are pretty simple quills, and a really simple ink made out of charcoal and water that I put together once years ago. So yeah, in this video, we'll show you how to do that. All right, the craft is very easy to make. It doesn't need that much, just some charcoal, which we have here. It's easy to buy at an art store. It can be a little pricey depending on where you go, or you can make it yourself, which we'll show you really briefly how to do that later. There's feathers here. I got these online. There's a lot of different art stores that sell them, about different types. There's even a couple that sell goose feathers they painted to look like other bird feathers, though you might want to be careful with those because some countries it's illegal to have things like eagle feathers, and people might assume it's a real one if you get one of those, so kind of be careful when you're buying those. These ones have damaged tips, some of them. If you're going to be doing something like actually cutting the quills out of these to make the tips, then that could be a problem if they're damaged, because it's a lot harder to treat them and get them ready, because you actually have to bake those, cool them off. There's a whole technique to that. What we're going to do is we're going to cheat though with these nice metal nibs. I got these at Michael's. They're just replacement nibs for quill pens. We're just going to attach those to these feathers and give them a bit of a flourish with these colored wires as well. So this is pretty easy to find different art stores. You'll need a bit of crazy glue, mostly just to help hold things in position as you're tying everything, because this metal wire is actually extremely slippery when you're trying to tie things with it. I have this jar as well, will be used for the ink when it's done. All right, so we have our feathers and nibs ready. So we'll start with making the pens, of course, because without the pens, you're not going to write much. These nibs are specially made for a specific type of pen, but because they have a rounded off area here, they actually fit very well around a feather. Unless you have a smaller one, you could, to a small extent, crimp them with a pair of pliers if you have to, but you have to be careful because these are extremely brittle, so they only flex a little before they actually snap in half. So it's one of those things where you have to be careful if you wind up crimping it. And even if you had to, you could always use maybe a hot glue or something to fill in the gaps if that comes down to that. The feathers, if they're intact, you're lucky. Well, if you pay extra, you can get ones that are for sure intact and not damaged, but some of them wind up sometimes damaged like this, which is probably why they were selling them for a lower value price. But I just put a blob of glue inside the end there to seal it, just so you don't have an open hole at the end. Yeah, so what we'll do is we'll just attach these. I have two nibs here in this set. One's a thinner one and one's a bit thicker. It might be hard to see that on the video. We'll just basically use that as primary and secondary. So you have your thinner and your thicker pens, basically. So when you're writing with these pens, you want to get feathers that are the pointer feathers. And usually the left or the right side. It depends on what hand you're going to be writing with. These are, I believe, right side pointers, and you can see how they kind of curve down in one direction, and that's because when you're holding it, it'll actually curve with your hand, which is a lot easier to hold. If you're writing with it this way or sideways, it can actually get a little awkward after a while. So it's better to get ones that have the right hand for whatever hand you write with. So the first step, we'll glue a little bit. So the nib itself is going to face this direction, along with the pen, like this. Doesn't need much. This is mostly to hold it in place, because the metal wire, once that's wound onto it, will also help hold it down. So this is more just to stop it from slipping around while you're working. And we might have to wait a couple of minutes for this to dry like this. I'll have to use a little more glue. Also, watch what brand of glue you got. I think this one was a dollar store glue. I did this with the actual super glue brand, and it worked a lot quicker. Or no, it was Gorilla Glue, which actually froze a lot quicker when it was put on the pens. Now there we go. So it's already starting to hold. Then grab some of this wire. Now, the first time I did this, I had magnetic wire I bought from Radio Shack years ago when there was a Radio Shack. And works great. It was different colors based on the diameter, but, well, it's designed for electronics and much more expensive per square inch, or per inch than this is, which is just model wire. So I'm going to start at the end, fold a little hook like this. Then what we'll do is, when it's wrapped around, the wraps will actually wrap. The first wrap will go under the hook, and the rest will go over top, and that'll help pinch it in position. And there's the little hook here. And actually, I'll make it slightly longer, so that's easier to work with. So, and then we'll start by making that first round piece, like this. And it's going underneath, and the rest will wrap over top. Let me actually put this in place. Maybe this wasn't the best glue for this job. Now the key here is patience when working with this. Because if you try to speed and rush the winding of this, you'll wind up with little crimps and little knots in the wire, and it'll just look hideous. Now, of course, a little bit of that gives you character, but too much and it just looks hideous. And what I'm going to do is this wire here, I'm going to hide it by putting it right along the side of the edge of the nib here when I wrap it. That'll also make it sit a bit better. I will say the magnetic wire was easier to work with, but it was also a smaller diameter. And I can feel tackiness, so you might get a nice blooper funny video of me gluing my hand to this forever. And maybe we can get people at the hospital to let us film them amputating my fingers to get it back off. Alright, so there's some of the coils, just to show how they're going on. One of them's a little bit messed up, but that's easy enough to fix just by carefully working the wire. Might not be possible to see on the camera, but you might be able to see where what I meant by having the hook go over top of the first coil and then under the rest. But the effect of this is actually pretty cool when it's actually put in place. So it gives you this nice textured kind of look to the end. Looks a little rugged, like somebody just quickly wrapped it together. Looks a lot better than if you were to try and split the quill and put it inside, or just glue it on the tip and walk away. But there's all sorts of stuff you can do with this. You could glue it on there, and then you could try to paint it in different ways to look like it's made out of different materials, which looks great in pictures, but or if you're just using it as a prop of some kind. But if you're getting a close-up look, this will look better because it looks like it's been handmade, which, well, for part of it, it is. All right. So I've got it wrapped most of the way like this. So once I got near to the end here, I'm going to cut a piece of here off for a second hook, and I'll feed it back through underneath the other coils. And I'll do it along the ridge here of the quill, because there's going to be a little cavity there that's just created by it not being perfectly matched. All right, so I've cut the wire. Now I've just bent it over just to show what I meant where I was putting it in. So it's tucked in right where the quill and the nib meet. And there'll be a very slight channel there, just because the two pieces are a slightly different size. And I'll slide it underneath there. If you have a pair of needle nose pliers or micro tools, that might be able to help with that. I guess some people have, yeah, you can buy jeweler's tools in some places, low quality ones. Actually, I thought I saw it at Dollar Tree once, a set of like jeweler's tongs kind of thing, which is kind of interesting. But micro tools like that will help you work with that. All right, and that gives us that. And then I'll put a very light blob of glue right at the very end to stop it from backing off and loosening up, because this wire can loosen like that. And I'll put a second one at the beginning where the other piece goes under, and that'll just hold everything in place. And the nice thing about super glue is it's practically invisible. But the idea is to try and get it, once you place it on there, wait until it dries before you touch it, because if you don't, little stuff that's stuck on your hand will stick to it, and the glue will even get a texture to it, and it'll become visible on the surface. It's not going to be a problem with silver like this, but if you're using colored ones, it becomes very obvious that it's there. You get this kind of whitish, opaque kind of stuff on top of it, and it doesn't really look very good. So I'll set that aside to dry. There we go. So, and then I'll just do the other one up, and then we'll be ready. And it kind of the precision you go for with this and how pretty you make it depends on the person. If you want it to look super pretty and perfect, yeah, take the extra time to do that. If you don't mind if it looks a little rugged, then it's not going to hurt it either. If anything, it might have a tiny bit of character if it does look rugged. It's not a glue project unless you've glued your hands to it, just like it's not a wood project unless you've cut yourself at least once. And if there's any kids watching this, yeah, don't follow that mentality. It's a bad habit to have. It's really hard to see if this glue is. The other stuff, it was a bit easier to see. This stuff, it's pretty much invisible coming right out of the bottle. There's the second one. Could have started a bit lower and made it a bit closer to make the piece wider, but I don't know. I think it looks pretty good. See, if you have a smaller diameter wire, like that magnetic wire I had, it's a lot easier to wind, and you'll get a tighter kind of wrap to it, a neater looking wrap. Wider diameter, it'll look more obvious. It'll give you kind of a grip. So it kind of just depends on what you're going for and what supplies you could find, really. It's a lot of times I've found stuff in a store and then it's gone. A few days later I go back to see if there's more. So it's hard to, especially if you're buying in art and craft stores and dollar stores. Those we wound up with. And the next step, well, we'll need some ink. So these will work just fine with any ink. We're going to make our own ink, though. We're going to use when I first started setting this recipe up for somebody else I was putting it together for, I jokingly called it Doc Fedick's 5-minute charcoal ink, because there was a technique where you had to wait 5 minutes before you could use it. Otherwise it would smear. The stuff we're going to use is a bit better than that, so it should work right away instead of having to let it settle for a bit. So yeah, that's what we'll do next. All right, so for making the ink, it's just going to be a simple charcoal recipe, which, well, it goes back centuries and centuries. Charcoal, it's one of the first ink recipes out there. There's different types that they have. So some of them they used to use what they called lamp black, where you'd burn oil lamps and you'd have metal or glass plates up in the area where the smoke would hit it, and then the crud that basically formed on those plates would actually be the ink, and they'd scrape that off and use it. Another one's vine black, which is dried up vines, and they turn into charcoal, which, like these vine charcoal sticks. There's other ones that use bones, anything else really that you could burn and to convert into charcoal or gather the black charcoal out of the smoke from. We're going to use a very simple recipe just using charcoal pieces, which are very easy to find. If you don't have access to a place where you can start fires, like you're in the middle of a large city, you can buy charcoal from art stores, but be careful. Like, some stores do charge quite a bit for their charcoal, but this stuff's very easy to find. Anywhere you can find wood or there's a campfire, you can gather it. So after a fire, this is where you get the charcoal from. In a lot of cases, you have uncooked logs like this, and underneath is charcoal, so you can break it off like that. There's pieces left behind in the fire after, and those come from coals, basically the glowing orange coals that were in the fire. Another trick you can do is even just scrape those orange coals out of the fire, let them cool to get those, or just break it off the logs like that. So what you'll need for that is something to crush it with. I bought a metal mortar and pestle. That's what I use for any art projects and things like that, because a stainless steel mortar and pestle seems like a great idea at first, but they tell you not to use stainless steel cookware, because if it gets scratched, it'll leach metals into your food, The same will happen with a mortar and pestle, but it's very nice to have for stuff like this, because it'll completely clean out when you clean it. But keep in mind, don't use your kitchen one and then try to use it for recipes afterward, especially with charcoal. It's gonna be disgusting. So the first thing we'll do is we'll just grind it up. Actually, I probably won't need very much out of this. So you want to try to, so I've tried this a few different ways. You could wet it before you grind it down, but then it winds up not grinding down very much. So then you wind up having to take the sludge out of the ink after it settles, and then regrind the sludge to get the ink out of it, which will work. But if you grind it up like this while it's dry, it's a lot easier to get a fine powder. But I can actually see little bits poofing out. So if you're doing it indoors, it's probably better to wet it and just grind it a lot more. And while you're grinding it, try to be careful not to poof a lot of that fine powder, because, well, that fine powder is basically the ink it's going to become. So this is pretty good here so far. Let's see if we can get a good shot of what that looks like. Yeah, it's very fine. There's still bigger pieces in here, and you can keep grinding it. If you grind smaller amounts at a time, it'll be easier to grind it into smaller bits. And then if you're doing that, you can grind a small amount, pour it into another container, grind a small amount, and just repeat over and over again. Then when you're ready, and you've gotten it ground down, you would add a little bit of water to it and then slowly grind it some more. So that's what I'm going to do here. To avoid splashing, I'll hit this first. There we go, that should be enough. So you want just enough to wet this and make it a sludge, because if you put too much water in, a lot of it will start floating inside of the water and basically suspended into it, which is what the ink is. It's just like coffee, basically. But if you add too much water and it does that, then you won't be able to grind it. So it's what you want to do is you want to keep grinding it. So this is kind of a process called muddling. That's the technical term. And we'll just grind the sludge. You can see I've turned it into a paste kind of thing. And so I'll grind that a bit. And it's probably not going to work perfectly. So this is kind of an iterative process where you do it a bit, you pour off the usable ink, and you grind up the stuff from the bottom of the container a bit, and repeat, basically. Yeah. And then we'll add a bit more water to it. So I got enough water in here. Yeah. So now I've got enough water in here. It actually just worked out. So what you do is you add a little water and grind it, and add a little water and grind it. And you want to go until the point where if you get some of it on the back edge here, you can actually see it start to, gaps start appearing because it's starting to run out of it. Or hopefully you can see that in the video. And that means that it's liquid enough to pour and use this with. So I'll grind it a tiny little bit more. Just grind the stuff off the edges. And then it'll be ready to pour into a container. And some mortar and pestles have a little pouring spout, which is a lot more convenient. But in this case, I'll just have to use a bit of luck and skill. I'll say it's all skill, though. Yeah, if you try to pour it too slowly, it'll just run down the back and pour out. So you have to be careful how you do that. And we got a bit of that. So if I were making a full bottle, I would just grind some more up, add water, and keep going till I had it full. But the process itself, it's not a really high yield process. So once you fill a container, the ink that's in here, it's, well, sloosh it around a little bit. You can see how much heavy sediment's in there. So if any of that stays in there, when you're writing with it, that goes on the paper, and then if you touch the paper, it'll smear. And it'll start streaking, just like charcoal does when you're writing with that. So what we'll do is it's kind of a process of waiting till it settles and pouring off the ink off the top, basically, and letting the heavy stuff settle. So we can set that aside. And then I'll grab out one that I've already made. All right, so I have a couple sets here. So this one, I had a funnel for pouring into a container like this. So this one is what I was using to actually make the ink, because that ground down sediment, you can actually grind it some more and actually get quite a bit more ink out of it than it looks like in that one bottle that I just did. Let's see if it's possible to see it. But there should be a visible layer where it's kind of a grayish color, a really dark. There's a really, really thick dark color here at the bottom. And if you look really closely, which we won't be able to see on the camera, you'll see kind of a dark layer just above the heavier gritty sediment. And that's actually the ink layer. And then the water layer here also has usable ink in it. But you want to get that other stuff just off the top of that. And the trick to doing that is literally just pouring it to do it. And then to pour it, I would just lightly do this and start pouring it out and watch the color layers. So pour off this top water layer, the other darker layer will kind of run off into it as you're pouring it, and it'll leave behind that really disgusting sludge layer that you can see there. And then once you've poured that off, you let it settle again. That might take a day or two, depending on how fine the grinds are. But the trick to getting it darker, if you need it, is you wait for a couple of days until you see a clear water layer and everything's settled to the bottom. Then if you carefully pour some of that water layer off and then mix it, it'll be a darker ink. So it depends on how much water you added, how dark the ink will wind up being. And this one we've already done before. You can see there's almost no sediment at the bottom, but this dark sediment's actually the dark ink layer that we're using for the actual ink. So I'm going to mix it. Then if you want to store the stuff, but you don't want to do it in liquid form, you could always pour it out onto something that you can scrape it off of later, let it dry. And the dried out stuff at the bottom, you just grind it up a little bit to make it loose, mix water in it, it'll turn right back into the ink again. It'll actually dissolve. There we go, so it's all mixed in. So the trick is also testing ink. So this stuff actually worked out pretty well the first time I mixed it, but the reason I called it 5-minute ink as a joke is because basically I stirred it, wrote something with it, waited a minute, wrote something else, and I did this for 5 minutes, writing each minute. And then when it hit 5 minutes and beyond, you could rub against it and it wouldn't smear. So that's why I called it that. This and then if you wind up with ink that does that, if you wait the 5 minutes until you can write with it clear, and then very, very carefully pour that liquid out and leave behind the sediment there, it'll be ready to go as soon as you stir it. So it's kind of a trick of different mixtures like that and pouring it out. So let's use this. You can look at my very nice looking writing that I have. So we write with it. That's what this ink looks like. Just written off of it. I wait a second till it dries, which actually dries pretty quickly. There's a couple spots I can see when I hold light up to it that got water in it, but yeah, I can see a very faint amount of streaks from that, but not very much. So in this case, I would just use it like this, because if I wait another 30 seconds and write with it, there won't be any signs of streaking at all. And you might not have even been able to see that on the video. So it's actually pretty good just right off the go like that. But if you wound up with streaks, you can either do an experiment where every minute you write some test writing with it and see if it streaks until it stops. If it's something like 1 minute, well, it's good to leave like that. Just make sure you leave it for, like, stir it first and get all your writing stuff ready and you're ready to go. If it's something like 5 minutes, you can take this and just very carefully, I should have, let's use this as an example. You can just very carefully pour it and leave the sediment at the bottom as you're pouring. And you can separate that usable ink like that. Would be better if we had an example, but I got very lucky and it just worked out in this case. Or actually, no, that's skill. Now with our writing implements, these are actually dry enough to use now. Let's see. And they can be a little bit finicky. So with these specific ones, you have to dip them deep enough to get this mechanism actually into the ink for these to work. Or if worse comes to worse, you can always scratch them very lightly with some sandpaper, like a rough sandpaper, to put little lines in it, and that'll give the ink something to stick to. But I can actually see a blob stuck to the top there, so this will work. So this is actually pretty light, so I will actually let that settle and pour some of the water off once it's fully settled, but that's going to take a couple of days for that to fully settle. So, and then I'll pour a bit of the clear liquid off and it'll be very, very dark. Part of it's also the pen, because the pen, I didn't quite get enough ink on it when I did it. So in that case, I would, well, it should be fine just using it, but maybe I'll rough it up a little with some sandpaper and then use it. Because some of them, they come coated for protection. Yeah, there's the an example to writing. So I guess that's the end of the video. Like, share, and subscribe, and all that stuff that people are supposed to say for these videos. Hope you enjoyed it. Well, see you again next time.